So who was this prophet? Amos. You know, I read that little story about him being dragged out by Amaziah and the priest. Now, I don't know exactly how it happened. But we know one thing's for sure. He was a prophet both to Israel and Judah. He was a shepherd, a herdsman. He was a nobody from Tekoa. But he was like John the Baptist. He was like Elijah, because he spoke about how offended God was with the common people in the daily life, and particularly. He lived, even though he was from Tekoa, which is a small town about 12 miles south of Jerusalem. Well, if you remember how the nation split, you know, you had Judah, and then you had Israel to the north, and 10 tribes of Israel to the north. And down here you had Jerusalem. He was from Judah, the area of Judah, because Tekoa is a town that's 12 miles. Here from, you know, halfway from Bristol to Kingsport, not a big distance from Jerusalem. But, you know, he said he was no prophet. And he was not a prophet's son. We see that, we'll read that about that in Amos 7:14. In my little story, you know, that's what he said. I'm not a prophet's son. But he spoke of all of the sins that the people were doing. And what happened to him? He was living in Israel, and he was cast out of Israel because he condemned Israel, and he told them the judgment that was going to come upon Israel. And the king didn't like it, so the king had him cast out of the nation of Israel. And so he went back to his hometown of Judah, I guess. He was an unschooled shepherd, poor, you know, a native of Judah, but he was called by God to prophesy to the northern kingdom of Israel during the reign of Jeroboam II, king of Israel, 793 to 753 BC. So during this time period, we don't know exactly when he wrote the book. Maybe it's sometime between 793 and 740, because he speaks of Jeroboam II, and he speaks of Uzziah, king of Judah, which was 791 to 740 BC. Sparing no one. What did he speak about? The coming day of the Lord. We talked about that in the last few weeks. The coming day of the Lord, that they would be judged, but that the world would be judged. Impending judgment was coming. The dominant note of the book is judgment. The final words promise the restoration of a righteous remnant of God's people. Again, very similar to the book of Joel in that respect, because God's judgment is going to come to the world. But, you know, we're living in a time right now where what's the world want? They want to do away with Christianity. I was listening to a legal podcast a couple of days ago when I was exercising, and it was telling the story that there was, and it didn't tell me, I don't remember exactly what town or city it was, but there was a lady in a city, and you know, the topic of discussion at the town council was schools. And she got up and she made her little talk. She's talking about, you know, parents should have the right to say so in their children's education. And then she said, I would like just now to say a little prayer, you know, for the town council, for the city, for the school board, and the mayor or the head of the town council stopped her and said, excuse me, you can't do that here. And she goes, well, it's just a little prayer. I just want to pray for the welfare of the school board and the school. And he goes, let's all take a break. You can't do that here. And then he tells the security in the town council meeting to remove her. All those that want to pray, remove them, you know, before we start back. You know, so what did they want to do? They're like Amaziah here. Kick Amos out, not the king. Kick Amos out. He read up. We don't want to hear about Christianity anymore. We have people who are trying to destroy. Well, again, it was like Amos. Amos was not a priest. He's not a member of the prophet's school. He was just a sheep herder, a shepherd, who took care of his sheep and also took care of sycamore, fig trees. He must have been educated somewhat, for his book shows literary skill. Perhaps he traveled extensively, selling his wool. The places he mentions may have been places he visited. In Amos' time, we find many instances in the Bible of God calling a man when he was in the middle of doing his daily job. That's another thing about Amos. Amos wasn't educated and called to be a preacher. He was just a believer that was called to do God's work. And God told him what he wanted him to do. So Amos was just an ordinary man. But God called him and sent him on his way with a shepherd's crook in his hand to gather God's straying people. Well, that's like David caring for his sheep, right? And Gideon in the middle of threshing wheat. He was a fearless man with a message from God. Not only was Amos unknown when he arrived in Bethel in the northern kingdom of Israel, he's rather unknown today. If I ask you, what do you think of when I say the word Amos? I'll bet most of you would say Amos and Andy. Right? When do you hear the word Amos? I mean, well, it's a popular radio program, a past generation. Amos and Andy, it's actually, you can still find a podcast or whatever. But we should associate Amos in the Bible. And he lived at the same time as Hosea. They were contemporary prophets, and I'm sure they knew each other. Hosea's message emphasized the love of God, but a God of love who also intends to judge. Amos spoke of the lofty judgment and the inflexible righteousness of God, which leads him to judge. And it's like I said, I think it was last week, or maybe we. One peculiar thing about God is that God doesn't want to judge man. God doesn't want to condemn man. But he will. He will, because he's righteous. He speaks. He spoke. He speaks in a global conception. He spoke first to the nations which were contiguous and surrounding the nation of Israel. He spoke of the great world powers of that day, and that's nothing unique. But then the later prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel also did the same thing. But the method of these other prophets was to first speak of God's judgment of the nation Israel and then take up the judgment of the other nations. Amos reverses that method. He speaks of God's judgment of the nations round about and then of Israel's judgment. When Amos first spoke in Bethel, saying that God was going to judge Syria, Philistia, Phoenicia, Edom, Ammon, Moab, everybody filled the king's chapel. Okay? They wanted to hear that. He's drawing a crowd. I'm sure Amos, when he first started out, they listened to him. Because this is something that people want to hear. Your enemies are going to be judged, Israel. Your enemies are going to be judged. But so are you. They didn't want to hear what was coming after. There are people even today who like a preacher to preach on the sins of the Moabites, which were committed 4,000 or more years ago, but any preacher who mentions the people's own sins is in real trouble. Amos exercised diplomacy. Speaking of the other nations first, he was an eloquent man. He used the language of Shakespeare. He was a great preacher. He lived in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. So these two kings, Joash and Jeroboam, were kings that lived during this time period which I mentioned. 2 years before the earthquake. This earthquake is mentioned by Zechariah nearly 200 years earlier. According to the historian Josephus, it took place during the reign of Uzziah. The most important thing is that this does is help us to see that Amos was a contemporary with Hosea, and he was one of the first prophets, and he was a prophet of the northern kingdom. And he said, the Lord will roar from Zion, will utter his voice in Jerusalem, and the inhabitants of the shepherds shall mourn, and the top of Carmel shall wither. Well, a very eloquent expression. Joel used this expression. The roar is the roar of a lion pouncing on its prey. So this is how Amos begins his message about the coming judgment. The habitations of the shepherds shall mourn, the top of Carmel shall wither. Well, a drought and a famine will come upon that land. You know, and Haifa is located there today, around over Carmel, and you know, again today it's beautiful flowers and shrubberies, and that was the way it was in Amos. But Amos now speaks, you know, judgments, begins in verse 3, of the nations that were contiguous and surrounding the nation of Israel. He gives us a worldview. The Word of God, even in the Old Testament, shows that God is not only the God of Israel, but God is the God of the Gentiles. God is the God of the entire creation, of the entire world. Same way in the New Testament, Paul is the one that makes that abundantly clear. And God judges nations. Although this day of grace has one great purpose, for calling out a people to his name, that does not mean he's taking his hands off the affairs of the world. And he's in control even today. The first nation that he considered, is Syria. We're talking about Syria now, and nowadays, but let's talk about Syria back then. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. Amos is not attempting to give us a list of the transgressions. He could have used could have said not 3, or not for 4, or not for 5, or not for 6, and not for many transgressions. I mean, there were many things. It says, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. This is the atrocity which Syria had committed, which had to be judged. Those threshing instruments were sharp and to be used to beat out grain, but they had been used to tear and mangle the bodies of the people of Gilead. In 2 Kings chapter 10, verses 32 and 33, we read, in those days the Lord began to cut Israel short, and Hazael smote them and all the coast of Israel, from Jordan, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites, the Reubenites, the Manassanites, the Aurora, which is by the river Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan. And Syria came down against these tribes and actually destroyed those tribes. What does Amos mean by Gilead? Gilead was on the east bank of the Jordan River, and it is the land which came up as far as the Sea of Galilee, where the tribes of Reuben and Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh remained on the wrong side of the Jordan. Syria is located to the right and to the north, and came down against them. Okay, and even today, you know, there is Syria may possibly be aligned with Turkey to come down against Israel in the future. God judged them back then for their cruelty. Again, we know that's going to happen in the last days. But I will send a fire to the house of Hazael, which shall devour the palaces of Ben-Hadad. Now break the bar of Damascus and cut off the inhabitant from the plain of Avon, and it goes on. The fire has come to Hazael, the king. That's the name of the king. And upon the palaces of Ben-Hadad. You know, again, the original city, original location of Damascus is not known even today. It claims to be the oldest city in the world, but is actually shifted around in the area to several different locations because it was burned to the ground several different times. God judged it and cut off the inhabitant of the plain of Avon. If you travel from Beirut to Damascus, you go by a place known as Baalbek, and Baalbek is in the plain of Avon. The ruins there are spectacular. The Romans attempted to colonize it because it was such a lovely area. But Baalbek has been destroyed. No great population lives in that area today. And the people of Syria shall go into captivity into Kir. Well, that means Kir is the Assyrians. Kir was a province in Assyria. So what he said, basically, is the same thing we know. We've seen even in Isaiah, about telling these nations that they will go into captivity. They will be destroyed because it's Syrians. I wish I had a map to show you, because it's easier to understand a lot of these things if you have a map to look at, and talk about where this location of this place is. Philistia, it's verses 6 through 8. For 3 transgressions of Gaza and for 4. Now, the area that we know as Gaza today, that Israel, that's the place where the Palestinians lived, and supposedly 2 million Palestinians. That's the place of Philistine Empire. Gaza was in the Philistine Empire, part of Philistia. The judgment against the Philistines was for making slaves. They took a number of Israelites and they sold them into slavery to Edom and to Phoenicia. The Phoenicians were great traders, and they in turn sold them as prisoners of war into slavery. They would send them all in the Mediterranean world. Because of this, God says he intends to judge Philistia. Now, right now we know Gaza was an Arab area, now under the control of Israel. Israel's having a real problem with that territory, as we now know, because of all the wars in the last year. However, Ashdod and Ascalon are still in Israel. You'll find in Ashdod there's a great refinery and a new harbor has been constructed. It's probably become a more important shipping place than Haifa ever began. Ascalon is directly south of Ashdod, and there you can see the remains of the temple of Dagon, where Samson was. These are real places, okay? And the judgment of God came upon these places as God said he would. I will send a fire on the wall of Gaza, which shall devour the palaces thereof. In the historical record during the reign of Hezekiah, we read that he, Hezekiah, smote the Philistines, even the Gaza, the borders thereof, and from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city, 2 Kings 18:8. The record says how Hezekiah destroyed all of that particular area. Amos' prophecy was literally fulfilled. You see, Amos is writing this back in this, what did we say, 790 to 740? Okay. Hezekiah didn't live at that time. Later. One thing you ask, about, again, how do you know that the Bible is real? How do you know that your God is real? Well, because it tells itself. It tells on itself. Because there are prophecies written hundreds of years before that are fulfilled within the text of the Bible. The judgment against Phoenicia for breaking its treaty. Now, Phoenicia. The judgment against them is not only, in verse 9, for selling slaves. The Philistines sold slaves to Phoenicia, and Phoenicia in turn sold them out in the world. But the judgment is for breaking their treaty with Israel. Hiram, king of Tyre, had been a personal friend of David, and they enjoyed many years of friendships. But no king of Israel or Judah had ever made war upon Phoenicia. Now Phoenicia had broken the treaty that was established by David. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyrus, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they've delivered up the whole captivity to Edom, and remember not the brotherly covenant. Again, the whole captivity to Edom, he could probably have listed 100 different sins, but then he's talking about the main ones. In other words, they've broken the covenant that they had with Israel, and they delivered some Israelites or Jews, to be slaves, and sold them to the Edomites, which we know Edom is southeast in the desert, Saudi Arabia. I will send a fire upon the wall of Tyrus, which shall devour the palaces thereof. First, the Assyrians, we'll back to that again. How did God destroy some of these nations? Same way we're reading in Isaiah, about the prophecies of the Philistines being destroyed by the Assyrians. Well, even this little shepherd out there from Judah knew what was going to come, because it was going to be the Assyrians coming against Tyre. They'd come against the city and were not able to take the city. There have been some questions whether the Chaldeans under Nebuchadnezzar took the city or not. However, it is conceded that Nebuchadnezzar forced the Tyrians to retire to an island that was about a half a mile out to sea. The Tyrians built a city there, and Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the old city that was on the mainland. 250 years later, there was this Greek conquering leader called Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great came along. He was very prosperous. He saw a very prosperous, wealthy city out on an island, and he built a causeway out to it. In doing so, he fulfilled Ezekiel's prophecy, in which said that God said that they would absolutely scrape the ground of old Tyre and throw it into the ocean. That's Ezekiel chapter 26, by the way. Alexander fulfilled Ezekiel's prophecy because he built a causeway out there. And then he took the island. And he captured the island and took all the wealth. He brought judgment to it. He destroyed it. And that be bringing an end to Tyre. So Amos' prophecy was fulfilled in two or three different stages. When Nebuchadnezzar came up against it and destroyed the old city, and then when Ezekiel's prophecy was fulfilled, with Alexander the Great building the causeway from the walls of the old city to get to the new city out on the island so that he could destroy it. And so Amos' prophecy was literally fulfilled. From the judgment against Edom, because of their revengeful spirit, and back of revenge, one ordinarily finds jealousy. The Edomites were jealous of their brothers. You see, Edom was from Esau. And Israel was from Jacob. Jacob and Esau were twin brothers, the sons of Isaac. All the transgressions of Edom. And for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and did cast off all pity. Now send the fire upon Teman, which shall defile the palaces of Bozrah. In the rock-hewn city of Petra, that is the capital, was the capital of Edom, which is located in the area called Teman. Everything was destroyed that would be burned. The palaces of Bozrah have been destroyed. They've disappeared. We don't know where they're at today. The prophecy of Edom has been fulfilled. Judgment came upon them because of their vengeful spirit. And finally, he gets down in verse 13. He talks about Ammon, the nation of the Ammonites. If you will notice geographically, we've been moving around almost in a circle. We began with Syria, north of Israel. Then we went to Gaza, Phoenicia, which is far out. And then we came down to Philistia, which is to the west of Israel and Jerusalem. And then we go now over to Edom, which is on the southeast side. And now we're to Ammon, which is on the east side. What's the cause of God's judgment against the Ammonites? Theirs was a violent judgment. The 3 transgressions and 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they ripped up the women with child of Gilead, that they might enlarge their border. The Ammonites are located on the east bank of the Jordan, and they joined with the Syrians in fighting against the 2 1/2 tribes of Israel, which was in the land of Gilead. They did it that they might enlarge their border. Now, if you remember, whenever Joshua was leading the tribes back, into the land of Israel, and they were dividing up the land, 2 1/2 tribes, half the tribe of Manasseh and 2 other tribes, they said, we want to be on the east side of Jordan. Okay? Now, all the other tribes are on the west side of Jordan. These 2 1/2 said they wouldn't be on the east side of Jordan. But they said, we will, if you will allow us to be on the east side of Jordan, we will fight and continue to fight with you against all the enemies. They made that agreement. So here they were over on the east side of Jordan, but what did you have over there? You had other peoples, the Ammonites. And what were the Ammonites doing? Well, okay, they did it that they might enlarge their border. The Ammonites were trying to destroy the nations of Israel that were on the east side. I will kindle a fire in the wall of Rabbah, and it shall devour the palaces thereof. This is God's judgment against the Ammonites. Rabbah was a great city, the capital city of the Ammonites. Later on, it was called Philadelphia by the Greeks. It was not the Philadelphia that we know in Revelation, because that's Philadelphia that's up in Turkey. But anyway, it was named after Ptolemy Philadelphus of Egypt. We know it today as the city of Ammon. Capital of the nation. What's the nation east of the Jordan River? We know it today as Jordan. The nation Jordan. That's where the Ammonites were from. we see that Ammon, the capital of the nation of Jordan, there you can see ruins of the great civilizations of the past, which were totally destroyed. 2 Kings chapter 8, we see the sin that God had prompted God's judgment against them. And Hazael said to Elisha, "Why weepeth my Lord?" And he answered, "Because I know the evil that thou wilt do to the children of Israel. The strongholds thou wilt set fire, and the young men thou shalt slay with the sword, and wilt dash their children, and rip up their women with child." In other words, kill the women having children that were pregnant. And Hazael said, "But what is thy servant a dog, that he should do this great thing?" And Elisha answered and said, "The Lord hath shown me that thou wilt be king over Syria." 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 12 and 13. In other words, Elisha said to Hazael, "You say that only a dog would do such a thing, but you're going to be that dog that does such a thing." Whether Hazael was a dog or not, he did a very thing he said he would not do. And that only a dog would do. And so what does that say? What does God say to that? "Because you have killed my people that were living on the east side of Jordan, and I give them the land, because you do such a violent thing to them, horrible, awful thing, I'm going to judge you. I'm going to destroy you. Kindle a fire in Ramah, and shall devour the houses thereof. And the king shall go into captivity, and his princes together." In other words, the entire nation shall be destroyed, and was destroyed. The Syrians have been, many, many times in the Bible. The Babylonians and the Syrians, were the agents that God used to bring about the destruction. And it's funny because, if you read that in that chapter, as we pointed out, if Israel was right here, the enemies to the northwest were destroyed. Another enemy to the northwest was destroyed. The enemies to the west were destroyed. The enemies to the south were destroyed. The enemies to the east were destroyed. And how did he do it? He used the Assyrians. He used a pagan nation to destroy the enemies of God's people.